What happens when justice is delayed but not denied? Today we uncover the chilling true crime stories that have haunted the world for decades, leaving us questioning what really happened. For decades, these haunting mysteries have consumed us, gripping our imaginations and filling our hearts with fear. The cases that left us all wondering who did this, why did it happen? The Zodiac Killer, sending cryptic messages, taunting police while he took innocent lives, leaving behind only clues and fear. The Golden State Killer, hiding in plain sight for years, a predator in the very system that was meant to catch him. The Grim Sleeper, lurking in the dark corners of Los Angeles, vanishing before anyone could bring him to justice. But here's the thing, we're no longer helpless. These chilling stories are about more than just the crimes themselves. They're about the pursuit of justice and the victims' families who waited decades for closure, the terror of not knowing, the endless questions. If you're as obsessed with these cases as we are, make sure to hit the subscribe button, because we're diving deep into these chilling mysteries, and we want you to be a part of it. This journey through the darkest corners of crime and justice starts right now. Families waited, terrified, unsure whether the truth would ever come to light. Detectives searched, suspects were questioned, but for decades the answers remained elusive. These were not just unsolved cases, they were unshakable mysteries, leaving us fascinated, yet helpless. The Zodiac Killer, a name that has haunted the residents of Northern California and terrified the world. Between 1968 and 1969, a killer stalked the quiet streets, leaving behind a string of gruesome murders and cryptic messages. His terror was not only physical, but psychological. He mocked the police, taunted the press, and left the public terrified with his letters, his ciphers, and his unpredictable madness. A man who seemed to always be one step ahead, a ghost, a phantom, impossible to catch. Who was he? What drove him to commit such horrific crimes? These questions have tormented the world for over 5 decades. But this isn't just a story of murder. This is the story of an unsolvable enigma. A killer who left clues but remained hidden, his identity shrouded in mystery. The Zodiac Killer's terror began on December 20th, 1968, when Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday, 2 teenagers, were shot and killed while parked in a remote area near Vallejo, California. It was brutal, methodical, and senseless, but what followed made it clear this was no ordinary killer. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Ferrin and Michael Maggio, were shot in a car, parked in a remote area near Blue Rock Springs Park. Ferrin died immediately, but Maggio miraculously survived. He was able to provide a description, but the killer slipped into the shadows once more. After each murder, the Zodiac would leave behind mysterious letters, taunting the police, bragging about his crime. He mocked their inability to catch him. He mocked their intelligence, and perhaps most disturbing of all, he demanded that his name be printed in the papers. Perhaps the most chilling part of the Zodiac's reign of terror were the ciphers. After each murder, the Zodiac would send cryptic letters, filled with symbols and hidden messages, to local newspapers. He claimed that if they were solved, the solution would reveal his identity. These ciphers were more than just puzzles. They were a game, a sick game, one that taunted not only the authorities but the very public that he was terrorizing. For years, the cryptographers, the police, and even the general public were baffled. The ciphers were beyond the reach of even the most experienced cryptographers, unsolvable for years. Pause, let the weight of this sink in. For decades, the Zodiac's letters went unreadable, his true message hidden within his codes, like a twisted riddle, always just out of reach. The police, the press, and even the public were forced to live with the knowledge that there was a killer among them, playing a game, while the authorities could do nothing but watch and guess. His reign of terror had gone on for nearly 5 years. 5 years of brutality, of fear, of cryptic letters, and taunting messages. The police had followed every lead, every suspect, but the Zodiac remained an unidentifiable ghost. The Zodiac seemed to disappear into the night, leaving only questions in his wake. For the families of the victims, the pain was unbearable. For the community, the terror never truly ended. Who was he? What did he want? And why was he so untouchable? For 50 years, the killer remained a mystery, and the question hung in the air like a dark cloud. Who was the Zodiac Killer? But then, in 2020, something unimaginable happened. A breakthrough. Something no one had ever expected. The case, long considered unsolvable, was finally cracked wide open. In 2020, after 50 years of silence, forensic genealogists and investigators used a powerful tool, DNA analysis. DNA found at crime scenes, which had been preserved for years, was finally analyzed with new techniques. The breakthrough came when investigators linked the DNA from the crime scenes to Gary Francis Post, a man with a shadowy criminal history. Gary Francis Post was no stranger to the law. He had a violent past and a history of crimes that had gone undetected, but he had been living among us, hiding in plain sight. A man who had once been convicted of other crimes was now revealed to be the most infamous serial killer in California's history. In a shocking twist, it turned out that Post had been hiding in plain sight for years. He had been a convicted criminal, yet somehow he managed to evade the police. How could the authorities have missed him for so long? For the families of the victims, this revelation brought relief, but not without a tinge of bitterness. The killer who had caused them so much pain, fear, and anguish for so long was finally unmasked. Betty Lou Jensen, David Faraday, Darlene Ferrin, Michael Maggio, all victims of a man who had slipped through the cracks for so long. Pause for emotional impact. The police had chased false leads, interviewed dozens of suspects, and questioned many people over the years. But Gary Post had been there all along, living just down the street, a ghost hiding in plain sight. After 5 decades, the world finally knew the identity of the Zodiac Killer. But while the case was solved, there are still so many questions that remain unanswered. Why did Post send the cryptic messages? What was the purpose of his letters? Why did he choose young couples as his victims? What drove him to commit these brutal, unspeakable crimes? Even after his identity was uncovered, the Zodiac Killer's legacy still haunts us. His cryptic messages, his taunting, and his apparent need to play a game with police and the public will forever be etched in history. But the most unsettling part of the Zodiac story, how many others are still out there, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. The Zodiac Killer's case is one of the most chilling true crime stories in history. For over 50 years, his identity remained a mystery, his actions a puzzle that could not be solved. But today we know the truth. Gary Francis Post is the man behind the terror that plagued Northern California and the world decades ago. The Zodiac's reign of fear may have ended, but his legacy lives on. His cryptic letters, his terror, and his twisted need to be noticed will never be forgotten. Justice was delayed, but it was never denied. And now, as the world finally knows his name, we must ask, how many more mysteries like this are waiting to be solved? For over 2 decades, the Long Island serial killer remained a phantom, a shadow in the dark corners of Long Island, New York, a killer responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women, many of whom were sex workers, vanished without a trace. But this case was not just a mystery, it was a tale of terror that gripped the hearts of families, survivors, and a community left to wonder, who did this? For years, these women's lives were reduced to anonymous victims, their names slipping away as they became nothing more than statistics in an unsolved case. But the truth remained buried, shrouded in darkness. For 20 years, the killer walked free, leaving behind only fear, speculation, and questions. Who could do this? And why could he remain hidden for so long? In 1996, the first victims disappeared, a series of women, young, vulnerable, often working the streets, looking for a way to survive in a world that didn't care. As these women vanished, so did the hopes of their families. Was it the work of a single killer, or were there multiple murderers hiding in plain sight? And then came 2010, when the bodies of 4 women were discovered in the desolate areas of Gilgo Beach, their lives snuffed out in a pattern that was too cold, too methodical, to be ignored. At first, there was no connection between the murders, no direct lead, but investigators began to see the pattern. These women were not just random victims. They were lured, targeted, and killed with a chilling precision. The killer was calculated, his victims often found in isolated areas, their bodies discarded as if they meant nothing. They were more than just victims. They were discarded lives, forgotten by the very system that was supposed to protect them. For years, the investigation led to dead ends. Detectives followed false leads, interviewed dozens of suspects, and worked tirelessly, but with nothing to show. The killer seemed to slip through the cracks, his crimes too methodical, his ability to hide too powerful. As time passed, new victims were found, and the terror continued to grip the people of Long Island. Family members of the missing women held onto a shred of hope that someone, somewhere, would finally catch this killer. Someone would hear their cries for justice. But with each passing year, the case grew colder. Detectives were burned out. The public lost faith. And the killer, if still active, remained one step ahead. How could anyone get away with such horrors? And why was there no end in sight? Then, in 2022, after more than 2 decades of silence, a breakthrough finally came. The DNA left behind at the crime scenes was finally analyzed with cutting-edge technology. Forensic ensigns used genetic genealogy to identify a suspect, a name that no one could have ever expected: Rex Heuermann. Heuermann was not just any suspect. He was a construction contractor from Massapequa Park, a man living quietly in the community where the women had once walked. He had been right there, blending in with the neighbors, the very people who had once trusted him: a father, a husband, a man who seemed ordinary, even respectable. But the truth about him was far darker than anyone could imagine. The killer, who had terrorized Long Island for over 20 years, had been hiding in plain sight, and the police had been looking in all the wrong places. When Rex Heuermann was arrested in 2022, it was more than just the capture of a criminal. It was the end of a nightmare for the families of his victim. These families had waited, prayed, and held on to hope for decades, never knowing if they would ever get the answers they so desperately needed. The arrest brought a sigh of relief, but it also left a burning question. How did this man, a former cop's son, a community member, hide for so long? For those who had spent years searching for their loved ones, the moment of closure was almost too much to bear. Finally, they had justice. Finally, they could rest knowing that the person responsible for the deaths of their sisters, daughters, and mothers was no longer free. But the terror didn't just stop with Heuermann's capture. The shadow of his crime still looms over the people of Long Island. How could the killer remain so close, so normal for so long? How could someone who walked among the people, who lived in a community, carry out such atrocities without raising any suspicion? The community is left grappling with these questions, as the ripple effects of the killer's actions continue to echo. Heuermann's capture is a bittersweet victory. Justice was served, but the wounds of the past remain. The families of the victims are left to pick up the pieces of their broken lives, knowing they'll never fully heal from the trauma and uncertainty that spanned over 2 decades. And the question still remains: how many others are out there? How many more monsters are hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment to strike? How many lives are still being destroyed by killers who blend in, unnoticed by the very communities they terrorize? The story of the Long Island serial killer is one of justice delayed and the long journey to truth. But it's also a warning that the monsters we fear may not always wear the mask we expect. They could be the person next door, the one you pass on the street every day. Their darkness hides in the most unexpected places, and even when they are caught, the scars they leave behind will never fade. The Golden State Killer, a name that sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with the history of violent crime in California, is a true embodiment of how evil can exist in plain sight. His case not only terrorized an entire state, but also left families shattered and police departments frustrated. For 4 decades, the killer, who operated with chilling precision, eluded authorities, leaving only sorrow, fear, and unresolved questions in his wake. Yet his capture in 2018 using the groundbreaking technique of forensic genealogy raised even more questions than answers. Between 1976 and 1986, the Golden State Killer, initially known by many names such as the East Area Rapist and Visalia Ransacker, was responsible for a string of brutal crimes that included 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 120 burglaries. His reign stretched across California, from Sacramento to Southern California, haunting a state already grappling with its own social upheavals during the 1970s. His crimes were not random acts of violence. They were methodical, calculated, and systematic, driven by a level of control and planning that would leave a lasting imprint on the victims, the investigators, and the entire state. Each attack seemed to follow a pattern, making the killer's behavior more terrifying with each new incident. What was even more chilling was the absence of clues left behind. His ability to leave no trace of his identity created an aura of invincibility around him. Victims were chosen at random, often based on opportunity rather than specific targeting, which made the public feel even more vulnerable because the killer could be anyone, anywhere. The grim nature of his attacks made the Golden State Killer's crimes stand out from other serial killers. He would often stalk his victims for extended periods before making his move, showing an eerie patience and calculation. He would break into homes under the cover of night, overpower his victims, and torment them both physically and psychologically, often forcing them to remain silent by threatening to harm their loved ones. What made his behavior particularly terrifying was his persistence and methodical approach. Once he established a pattern, he stuck to it, showing a clear desire to control the narrative of his crimes. His ability to avoid detection for so long, all while leaving behind DNA evidence, marked him as a formidable opponent to law enforcement. He didn't just commit these heinous acts and vanish, he actively mocked the police with cryptic letters and taunting messages sent to newspapers and law enforcement agencies. In these letters, the killer boasted about his crimes and the fear he had instilled, making it seem like he was always a step ahead of those trying to catch him. After committing numerous crimes between 1976 and 1981, the Golden State Killer seemingly vanished from the scene. But his silence was not a sign of his cessation. Rather, it fueled the haunting question that plagued both investigators and the public. Where had he gone? Was he dead, in prison for other crimes, or had he simply stopped for a time, perhaps due to his changing circumstance? The unsolved nature of his crimes turned him into a mythical figure, a phantom killer, who despite leaving a trail of death and destruction, was able to evade detection and disappear from the public radar. The fear he caused during his active years was replaced by the chilling reality that he could be alive and still roaming free. His inactivity, however, did nothing to alleviate the terror of his past victims or their families, who were left wondering, will we ever know who did this to us? 2018 brought a shocking breakthrough in the case that had long been thought unsolvable. Forensic scientists, using cutting-edge DNA analysis, were able to connect evidence from the Golden State Killer's crime scenes to Joseph James DeAngelo, a man with a history of violent behavior, who had previously worked as a police officer. The chilling twist was that DeAngelo had served in the same law enforcement agencies that had worked tirelessly to track down the killer for decades, making his capture a stark reminder of how close he had been to the very people investigating him. The breakthrough came through the use of forensic genealogy, which matched DeAngelo's DNA to evidence previously left at crime scenes. This process, still relatively new at the time, allowed authorities to identify a close family relative and eventually trace the lineage back to DeAngelo. For decades, his DNA had been sitting untouched in evidence files, waiting for the right technology to make the connection possible. When DeAngelo's identity was finally revealed, it sent shockwaves through the public and law enforcement alike. How could a man who had been working as a police officer, someone who was supposed to serve and protect, be the very person responsible for some of California's most gruesome and unrelenting crimes? The emotional fallout from this discovery was profound. The idea that someone entrusted with upholding the law could be living among the people he terrorized was more than just a betrayal of his oath. It was a terrifying revelation about the nature of evil and how it can blend into society unnoticed. For the victims' families, the arrest brought closure, but it was a bitter realization. They had lived with the fear that the killer could strike again, never knowing that he had been living among them all along. The arrest of Joseph DeAngelo, while bringing closure to the families of the victims, raised unsettling questions. How many others like him are there? How many killers have hidden in plain sight, operating under the guise of normalcy while wreaking havoc in secret? The Golden State Killer's case was not just a victory for forensic science. It was a grim reminder of how dangerous it is to underestimate the darkness that can exist behind a person's public facade. For the families of the victims, the long wait for justice was finally over, but the cost of that justice was unimaginable. They had waited decades to know the truth, only to learn that the killer had been working in the justice system all along. Their pain was not erased by the capture of DeAngelo, though it was undeniable that they felt a sense of justice they had been denied for so long. The story of the Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, is a haunting one. His reign of terror stretched for over 40 years, and the psychological toll on the victims' families is impossible to measure. Yet the story does not end with his capture. The Golden State Killer's legacy lives on in the way society responds to the trauma of serial killers, in how law enforcement evolves to keep up with new technological advances, and in the way we view the darkness that can exist within seemingly ordinary people. DeAngelo's capture is an example of justice served, but also a stark reminder that justice can be delayed, sometimes for far too long. The advances in forensic science and the introduction of genetic genealogy opened a new chapter in criminal investigations. But how many more unsolved cases are there? How many killers remain hidden in the shadows, waiting for their moment to strike? DeAngelo's case is a lesson, not just in crime but in the human condition. It teaches us that evil can hide in plain sight. It also serves as a reminder that sometimes, even with all the advances in technology, The hunt for justice is not always straightforward. There are no easy answers, no simple explanations, just a long and painful journey to uncover the truth. The Golden State Killer may have been unmasked, but his legacy lives on, not just in the horrific crimes he committed, but in the reminder that monsters can sometimes wear the masks of normalcy. D'Angelo's story serves as a chilling reminder that the darkness we do. Do you think there are more killers like the Golden State Killer, hiding in plain sight? How many others have lived among us unnoticed? Leave your thoughts and theories in the comments below. And if you're captivated by the darkness of true crime, and want to dive deeper into more unsolved mysteries, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more chilling stories. In 1977, a 32-year-old single mother, Dorothy Jane Scott, vanished after attending a routine work meeting in Anaheim, California. The night began like any other, yet it would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt her family for over 40 years. Dorothy was a woman full of life, a mother to a young boy, and a woman with a bright future. Yet in one tragic moment, she disappeared without a trace. Her disappearance was no ordinary missing persons case. There was no evidence of foul play at first, just an unsettling, inexplicable gap in her life. But as the days passed, something darker began to unfold. Dorothy's family would receive anonymous phone calls, each one more chilling than the last. Someone knew too much. Someone had been watching, but who? And why did they torment the family with these calls for months after her disappearance? Initially, detectives had little to go on. No witnesses, no clear suspects, and no forensic evidence. It seemed like Dorothy had vanished into thin air. For a long time, the case was treated as a possible abduction, but without solid leads, the investigation began to fizzle. Her family, desperate for answers, clung to the only clue they had, the series of phone calls that came after Dorothy's disappearance. Imagine the pain of not knowing. Dorothy's mother, Betty Scott, received these disturbing calls. The voice on the other end was always cryptic, sometimes giving details that only someone who knew Dorothy could know, and at other times the voice would make eerie threats, as if taunting Betty with the knowledge that her daughter had not been taken at random. The calls became more sinister, and as the months turned into years, the police were left with dead ends. The case grew colder, and the hope of finding Dorothy alive or dead seemed to slip further into the abyss. Her family was left searching for answers with no one to help them, living in the limbo of uncertainty. What had happened to their beloved daughter, their sister, and who was behind these tormenting calls? By 1980, Dorothy's case had become an unsolved mystery, one that had slowly faded from the media's attention, though the pain of her disappearance never dulled for her family. Betty Scott and Dorothy's father lived in constant torment, wondering if they would ever have an answer. For 4 years, the calls kept coming, each one a cruel reminder that Dorothy's fate was still unknown. But then came the break that no one expected. In 1981, police learned that the caller had contacted other families, striking terror across multiple households. The voice seemed to know too much about each woman's life, each victim's personal details. Was this the work of a serial killer, a sick individual with a twisted sense of power and control? Her family's pain wasn't just the disappearance, it was the not knowing. For 40 years, Dorothy's mother never stopped looking for her. The search didn't end when Dorothy was declared missing. It continued every single day of her life. The torment of not knowing what happened, or where her daughter's remains lay, haunted Betty Scott every waking moment. How does a mother go on knowing her child is gone, but still missing the final piece of closure? For decades, Dorothy's case remained in limbo. The haunting phone calls stopped, but the empty space left by her disappearance remained. But in 2021, after 40 years of heartache, the truth finally came. A breakthrough that would shock the nation and bring a long-awaited sense of closure to Dorothy's family. DNA testing, the kind of forensic technology that wasn't available in 1977, was used to finally identify the remains found years earlier. In 2021, DNA evidence linked Dorothy's remains to James M. Roskowski, a man with a disturbing history of violent crimes. He had lived on the outskirts of Anaheim, but his name had never once surfaced in the investigation. His mugshot did not ring any bells, and yet he had been the one to commit the crime that had tormented Dorothy's family for over 4 decades. Roskowski, once a name that no one would have thought to connect to Dorothy's disappearance, was now the man responsible for this haunting. His capture didn't just bring Dorothy's family relief, it brought a sense of justice that had been denied for far too long. After 40 years of waiting, a mother could finally find peace, knowing that her daughter's killer had been found. But it wasn't just the killer who had been exposed, It was the system that had failed them for so long. How could someone with Rostkowski's violent history have slipped through the cracks? Rostkowski had been arrested and convicted of other violent crimes in the 1980s, but his name had never been seriously linked to Dorothy's case. Why? How had he been allowed to live freely for so long? The authorities had missed him, and in the process, Dorothy's family had paid the price of living without answers for all those years. For Dorothy's family, the relief was undeniable, but it came with an overwhelming sense of sorrow. They had lost decades of their lives to a case of uncertainty. The life they could have lived together as a family was forever altered by a monster who had stayed hidden in plain sight. Dorothy's son, now grown, could never have his mother back, and the family would never truly be whole again. The truth was now known, but there was no escaping the loss that had already taken place. For the Scotts, justice was a bitter victory, a relief, but with the knowledge that it had come too late. After 40 years, Dorothy's family could finally rest, knowing that her killer had been brought to justice. But the relief came with a cost. The emotional scars of waiting, of living with unspeakable loss, couldn't be healed in an instant. Rostkowski's capture didn't bring back Dorothy. It didn't erase the pain of her absence. No matter how much time passed, no matter how much justice was served, the wounds remained. But one thing was certain: Dorothy was no longer a ghost. She was a person, a daughter, a mother. Remember, though justice was finally served, Dorothy's story is a tragic reminder of the long road to closure. For the victims' families, the journey doesn't end with an arrest. It ends with grief. And yet, after decades of silence, Dorothy Jane Scott's family could finally say goodbye, knowing the person responsible for their pain had been caught. But in their hearts, the real question still remains: how many others are out there, slipping through the cracks, still hidden in plain sight? What do you think about Dorothy Jane Scott's case? Between 1985 and 2007, Los Angeles lived in the shadow of a killer, one whose reign of terror stretched across decades. This killer, known as the Grim Sleeper, was a silent predator, responsible for the deaths of at least 10 women, and potentially many more. His murders were brutal, his methods chilling, and his presence lingering over Los Angeles like an unspoken nightmare. But the most unsettling part of his story was the long hiatus between his killing sprees. Could this be a different killer altogether, or was he just lying dormant, waiting for the right time to strike again? The Grim Sleeper's first known murders came in 1985, but then the killings abruptly stopped. For nearly 14 years, the police and the public had no idea where the killer had gone. Was he dead? Was he in prison for something else? Or was he out there living among the people he once terrorized, waiting for the right moment to return? For more than a decade, the Grim Sleeper's name faded into the background of Los Angeles' troubled streets. His victims were primarily women of color, many of whom were involved in drugs, prostitution, or living on the fringes of society. For years, the police believed the murders could be connected to the crack cocaine epidemic that had swept through Los Angeles in the night. But as time passed, the questions remained. Who was this killer, and why was he so elusive? In 2002, the killings suddenly resumed. This wasn't just a new wave of killings, it was a return of the Grim Sleeper, now more brazen than ever. The police were left with only fragments of evidence, and in the age before modern forensic breakthroughs, they were left to piece together what little they had. The killer had returned after so many years, and this time he was bolder, more methodical, and more ruthless. The hunt for him would continue, with nothing concrete to latch onto, only whispers of a killer who had been hiding in plain sight. 2010 marked a turning point, a breakthrough in forensic science that would change everything. The case of the Grim Sleeper had grown colder with every passing year, but new technology had come to the forefront of criminal investigations. Familial DNA. Law enforcement officials began revisiting old DNA evidence collected from the crime scenes. They were determined to see if they could connect it to a person, a suspect, anyone. Then a chilling discovery was made. Lonnie David Franklin Jr., a man with a disturbing history of violence, was linked to the crimes through DNA. Franklin had worked as a mechanic for the Los Angeles Police Department, an ironic and unsettling twist to the case. A man who had once served the law, who had been surrounded by law enforcement his entire life, had been hiding in plain sight, committing heinous crimes for years. Franklin's arrest was a shock, not just because of his connection to the crimes, but because he had been so deeply entrenched in the community and police department. The most unsettling part of his story was that he had lived under the radar for so long. A killer who had evaded capture, not by being hidden in dark alleyways, but by being an everyday man, blending in with the very community he terrorized. Lonnie David Franklin Jr. had a history of violent behavior, but for years, He was just another ordinary man in the eyes of the police. He had been in contact with many of the victims, but had somehow escaped the law's scrutiny. How did he manage to evade capture for decades? How did someone like him, a man with a violent past, become so invisible to the authority? Franklin's criminal past was not just limited to the murders. In his earlier years, he had been involved in violent altercations, but the evidence had never been strong enough to make an arrest. He seemed to have lived a relatively normal life, always staying just below the radar. His family members too were unaware of the man he truly was, someone capable of such dark acts. The families of the Grim Sleeper's victims had lived in a constant state of uncertainty. They didn't know if their loved ones had been taken by a serial killer, or just fallen victim to the grim reality of life on the streets. For years, they searched for answers, desperately hoping that one day, someone would identify the monster who had taken their family members from them. When Franklin was arrested, it was a moment of shock and relief for many. The killer they had been chasing for decades was finally caught, but the families of his victims could not simply move on. Their loved ones were gone, their suffering had lasted for decades, and now, with the truth finally revealed, they had to face the horror that had been lurking in the shadows all these years. Victims' families, some of whom had grown older and passed away without ever knowing what had happened to their loved ones, could now finally grieve. The man who had stolen their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, was behind bars. But despite this, the grief, the loss, and the years of waiting could never truly be erased. Franklin's capture didn't bring back the years of pain, nor would it ever give them the time they had lost. For those families, the arrest was not a celebration. It was a moment of bittersweet closure, the agony of knowing that justice had come too late. They could finally begin the process of healing, but the scars of the past would never fade. The legacy of the Grim Sleeper wasn't just the murders, it was the decades of terror that accompanied each killing, the fear that no one was ever truly safe, and the darkness that surrounded Franklin's true identity for so long. The Grim Sleeper is not just the name of a killer, it is a chilling reminder of the evil that can go unnoticed for so long. How could Franklin, a man who had been in close contact with the police, had a history of violence, and who had been living in the same community, remain unnoticed for decades? This is the legacy of the Grim Sleeper, a killer who hid in plain sight, a man who lived a double life for years. The question remains, how many others like Franklin are out there hidden among us, waiting for the right moment to strike? And how many more lives are in danger, kept safe only by luck? The arrest of Franklin was a moment of justice, yes, but it was also a reminder of how easily monsters can hide in places we least expect. Each of these cases represents more than just a tragedy. It's a story of resilience, persistence, and the remarkable advancements in forensic technology. For the families of the victims, the long wait for justice has finally come to an end. But as we take a breath and reflect on the breakthroughs that have been made, we're left with one lingering question. How many other mysteries remain unsolved? How many more families are out there waiting for justice? Just as these victims' families once did, as technology evolves, so too does our ability to uncover the truth. Forensic advancements, genetic genealogy, and innovative methods are making it possible to crack cases once thought to be lost forever. But while we take steps forward in the fight for justice, some questions will always remain. What drives a killer to commit such heinous crimes? And how long will it take for other unsolved cases to find their own resolution? The pain of these families is a reminder of the darkness that lingers, waiting for the light of justice to shine through. If you've been captivated by these chilling stories, the mysteries that were finally solved after decades of pain and waiting, then hit subscribe for more updates on the world's most haunting unsolved crimes. Leave your theories and thoughts in the comments below. Let's continue the conversation. How many more mysteries are out there waiting to be uncovered?